So my name is Derek Scott. I'm a certified IFS therapist and approved consultant. I've been working in the IFS model for about 18 years now. And prior to that, I was working in AIDS-related multiple loss and grief. So was able to transfer a lot of that learning into how I now understand attachment and loss from the lens of multiplicity, which is the IFS lens. Sure. When you're looking at the impact of the pandemic, particularly when you're looking at it from the lens of a loss model, uh, there's a number of factors which we need to consider. Some people will identify very quickly that they've lost, their sense of safety in the world. They may have lost family members. There may be other losses that clients will come in and need to be able to address and speak to. In terms of the therapist or the counselor, that may not be our experience, and it may not be the experience of all of our clients at all. So the experience of loss depends on the experience of the attachment. And if someone was very attached to the world being ordered in a particular way and predictable and able, controllable and all of that, then the pandemic is going to have shattered all of those assumptions, and no doubt that individual will be living with a lot more anxiety than they were before. And being able to identify that as a loss, and then the parts that get involved in the loss, helps people begin to process it in a way that that integrates the experience. But that said, our early experiences of losses, all of us, will often determine the parts that come up around it. So for example, if as a child you moved towns, or your parents divorced or separated, those will be significant losses in your life. And however the adults around you responded to those losses will determine how you respond to losses today. So for example, if you moved towns, and in your childhood that meant you lost everything. You lost your peer group, you lost your beloved teacher, and you started in a new town. And you had parents who were saying, no, this is great for us. We're going to make more money. We're going to live in a bigger house. Then that experience of, but I've lost all of my friends and I don't know what to do, protective parts will come in and just minimize that, just like the parents did, right? Oh, it's not that big a deal. Why do you have to make such a fuss? Blah, blah, blah. And so typically those same protective parts will come up in our system when our clients are presenting, and we're going to want to mobilize from those places. So being able to identify our own responses to loss, the parts of us that come up, the protective parts of us that come up, and asking them to just kind of ease back a bit so we can be more present to the reality of the client, however their parts need to present, right? But also to be alert to, we know from the pandemic that there's been a significant increase in domestic violence, in drinking, in eating. We call those firefighters in the internal family systems model. So those are parts that either distract from the parts holding the distress or want to provide comfort. Because we've seen the increased firefighter activity, we know that that's connected to what we call exile activity, parts holding the distress of their response to the pandemic. And as we hopefully begin to move out of the pandemic into the new normal, it may be that it feels safe enough now within the system for the individual to be able to attend to those parts holding the distress. So one of the ways in, from a counselor's or therapist or mental health professional's perspective, is to simply ask people, so during the pandemic, how did you cope? Or very directly, did you find yourself drinking more? Did you find yourself getting more angry? We're asking questions about what we call firefighter activity in IFS. And then within the IFS model, we'd need to get permission from those protected parts to get to know the parts that are holding the distress. And the way we do that is by appreciating, normalizing, respecting, and validating those protective parts. They helped us cope. How did you cope during this extraordinary and unprecedented experience? How did you cope really? So those are some of the questions that attendees will be invited to answer to the degree that they feel comfortable. There's no requirement that they do that, but certainly to consider exploring it. How did you cope? How did I cope? How did we cope as mental health professionals and human beings? And if we can identify that we did indeed cope and that we needed to cope and that there was distress associated with the pandemic, which of course there is for all of us, then we can also look at that in terms of what did we lose? What did we lose in all of that? And then what's left? Because we're here and we exist and we have all these wonderful internal resources. and from there, what's possible. You can't, people want to leapfrog to the next. Let's go to the new normal. Let's do all of that. And the parts that have experienced the losses and the distress of the pandemic will keep nudging at our consciousness. You can't leapfrog over them. We need to come to them, let them know that we're there, let them know that we can hear and attend to what's going on for them. And in the IFS framework, we do that from what we call self, which you might think of as your best self or your highest self. So that's going to be the focus of the day. Yeah, it's also going to be fun, you know, that when you get to know your parts inside the little people inside you, it can be both tremendous fun, and even though the topic of, you know, loss and grief sounds heavy, there's tremendous relief when we're able to bring compassion into the system and say, you know, what happened? What happened? You know, which parts of us had a hard time in the pandemic? You know, for myself, there was early on a part of me that was absolutely terrified, just terrified. It believed that this was the end of everything. You know, supply chains were dropping. There was craziness in the United States. Are we going to be invaded by, you know, crazy Americans holding guns? And instead of being stuck in the fear, I was able to attend to that part of me that was holding the fear. It was a young part. It got very frightened early on because his world was so disrupted, and just being able to sit with it and say, I've got you. I know you worry about this. Enable my system to come back to calm. So one of the gifts of the IFS model is that it facilitates self-regulation very specifically in these ways. And it's fun.